Sometimes we have the sense that what we are living is not our true life. We become aware of this in various ways. It might be a sense of longing for something different, or a lingering dissatisfaction with how things are. Perhaps we feel false or fake. We may even begin to notice it in our own behavior or how we respond to those around us. We might think to ourselves, was that me? Did I say that? Our bodies speak to us too. During a tense time, my back aches and I can suddenly drop 10 pounds in a month. Sometimes we are not living our own life because of other people's expectations for us. I think about this a lot as a priest. I especially felt that pressure when I was a teenager and in my early 20s. LGBTQ plus people have taught me a lot about how the expectations of society can warp and distort how we live. In this youthful, beautiful San Francisco, the poet May Sarton's reflections about growing older might be particularly helpful. She writes, "Now I become myself. It's taken time, many years and places. I have been dissolved and shaken, worn other people's faces. Perhaps you have worn another's face too." Fear also makes it difficult to live our true life. It is almost impossible to be yourself when you are afraid. That is why poverty, racism, and violence cause so much more damage than we expected. Not long after we first arrived, our family went on a tour of Grace Cathedral, and they were so generous. They took us everywhere, all the hidden places that normal people don't get to go. And we went up and to the very top of the catwalk there, and I opened the door for everyone. I'm very gentlemanly, and everyone went ahead of me, and we were out on the catwalk, and I couldn't look at them anymore out there. I was so afraid, even though it was totally irrational, that I had to go back into the bell tower where I just couldn't see them walking along the catwalks. And so I missed a really important part of our day together. It's a kind of metaphor for what happens with us socially. Fear, it makes us miss out. When we were in our 20s, our house burned down, and a very good friend took us in for a few nights. And we kept in touch, and years later, when we were in graduate school together, I gave a response to a paper she wrote for a small seminar. And she didn't like what I said. She was angry, and she refused to ever meet with me to talk about it. Fear of falling off the catwalk might be an irrational fear, but fear of breaking the relationships that are most important in our life, that is reasonable. Now, this is a special problem for Christians. We have come to see that the truth lies not in asserting our own power, but in the way of Jesus. Through Jesus, we experience ourselves as God's children. We try to love God first and our neighbor as ourselves. We don't always have to be right. We feel a new kind of freedom that comes out of relying on God's forgiveness. We don't have to make everything happen that happens to us. And we can allow ourselves to rely on God. And when we most need it, often we feel Jesus walking along with us, or in the very people who are in places like this. Others talk as if Christianity is simply an idea in our heads, but it is not. Our faith becomes the basis for how we see the world, and in turn, the decisions that direct us. And in the long run, faith forms our habits. Faith is an action, which leads Paul to call it the peace that passes all understanding. Many of us experience this all the way in the deepest part of our being. The story of God, that vision for living our true life, is deeply rooted in our consciousness. And yet, in our age, Christians have an especially difficult time living what we are. We have learned to put on a secular mask to, in effect, hide what we know is true. Our son was at a large high school in Silicon Valley, and he told me that he would almost never talk about religion there. He says that the people there so fundamentally misunderstand what it means to be a believer that he just doesn't even bother to try to explain. He points out that so much of what they used to say about Christianity came out of a deep ignorance about what it means to walk with Christ. They had so many incorrect assumptions about the literal reading of the Bible, for instance, or opinions about people of other faiths, or our position on social issues, that they just could not imagine what it would be like to follow Jesus. But there's more to this than just ignorance. They are offended, not just by what we say, but by who we are as Christians. Now, I have to give non-Christians credit. We have done and continue to do a lot that makes it easy for us to be misunderstood. But even this does not account for how offended the world is in the face of our message, in the face of the good news. I love the Gospel of John because in it, Jesus experiences this offense himself. He talks about people who abide in him, people who are so close, so near to him, that it is as if they had eaten his flesh and drunk his blood. And he goes on to say that the one who eats this bread, this companionship, this love, this fellowship, will live forever. He then calls God the Father and claims that it is God who draws people to him. Now, it's hard to know from this very short reading exactly which of these claims offended the people. But John writes, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went with him. I have no idea how to read it, but Jesus, he seems hurt when he asks the 12, do you also wish to go away? Now, you probably have your own theory about this story and about the offense that Christianity causes some people. Maybe it has to do with what we see on television or read in the news. But I want briefly to share with you 3 different visions from 3 different Christians, what they thought about this offense. And these are just very short, very compact, very hard to understand sections. So if you daydream, it's okay. You may not be the only one. The first idea of Christian offense is from my friend Herman Waetjen. He's a professor emeritus of biblical studies at San Francisco Theological Seminary. And Herman gets right to the point. He says that the offense comes from the shocking images that Jesus has used. Jesus seems to be connecting cannibalism, eating a person's body, to the nation's founding story of the Passover meal, before the people of God escaped slavery in Egypt. And Herman points out that Jesus is not calling for Israel to become the new overlords, but Jesus wants to terminate all forms of domination. This is so hard for us to understand. Instead of sacrificing a lamb, Jesus insists that we sacrifice ourselves for the liberation of all people, for the whole creation. So that's that first section. The second section is about the Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard. You can see his picture in the window. He's wearing a purple suit. It's one of my favorite images in the windows. But Kierkegaard took the idea of offense very seriously, and he talks about 2 different sources of offense. He believes that we as human beings cannot know the infinite without giving up our finitude. And yet at the same time, it is the nature of human reason to try to go beyond itself, to try to think what cannot be thought. Offense comes from the pain of desiring something that is impossible for us. Kierkegaard also goes on, and he says that human beings prefer teachers like Socrates, who says that the truth is already in us, to teachers like Jesus, who himself is an essential part of the message he conveys. It is not enough for us simply to know what it is that Jesus teaches. Because we keep falling back, we depend on a continuing relation with Jesus. And this offends our desire for independence, to choose our own way, a way that is apart from God. And finally, the third theologian on offense is Paul Tillich, whose image is also in the stained glass window, teaching at a podium. Tillich points out that there are 2 different kinds of knowledge. There is what he calls controlling knowledge, which depends on objectivity and is the way that a person treats the world as full of things to be used. He writes, quote, controlling knowledge claims control of every level of reality. It says that life, spirit, personality, community, meanings, values, even one's ultimate concern should be treated in terms of detachment, analysis, calculation, and technical use. For many people today, this is the only kind of truth. They are offended by what Paul Tillich calls receiving knowledge, the subjective or emotional experience which, quote, takes the object into itself, into union with the subject. Much of what we encounter in religion changes the one who is experiencing it, and that is part of its truth. Waetjen, Kierkegaard, and Tillich each give us a different picture of the offense that Christians experience in talking about Jesus. Maybe at the most basic level, people realize that believing in Jesus means that we have to change our life. The Apostle Paul offended people enough to be called an ambassador in chains, and he wrote words that transformed my life when I was a teenager. He says that faith, kindness to others, the Spirit of God, Holy Scripture, truth, all these act like defensive armor as what he calls the shield of faith. And this armor protects us from being harmed. It allows us to be ourselves, to live the way our hearts are calling us to live. It's a way of reminding us that even in the most hostile of circumstances, God will give us what we need. In John Calvin's words, nothing which pertains to our safety will ever be wanting. So this week, I want to suggest a simple homework assignment for you. The first part is for each of us to speak to someone, maybe even someone here today, about your experience with offense. And the second part is to have at least one moment of boldness when we are not embarrassed of our faith or try to hide it from someone who is important to us. Our life is too precious, too short not to fully live. I want to conclude with a poem, an excerpt of a poem by Mary Oliver called When Death Comes. When death comes, like the hungry bear in autumn, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness. When it's over, I want to say all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I've made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. Are you living what is truly your life?